Very excited for this discussion as it comes on the heels of several other panels that have touched on some of these really key issues, and we get to deep dive a little bit more. So framing, we'll get started with introductions, and a key question, which is what does responsible AI deployment look like for each of you in your context, and what does it mean for you? So if I could ask you to start introducing yourself and answer the question.
Great, I'll try. Hi, I'm Kriti. I lead legal products, legal tech products at Thomson Reuters. And at the same time, I've also, a few years ago, did the most amazing and the most terrifying thing ever, which is I founded AI for Good, which is a social enterprise in the UK. And responsible AI, with my two hats on, comes to me in a couple of guises. One is, it really pains me to hear about AI fear-mongering. It's going to come and take our jobs and cause all these challenges, which to some extent are true. But then equally, we can use AI to create so much more positive impact. And through some of our work, we saw we could create more equitable, affordable access to justice. We could reach people who we couldn't reach before. And that's really the impact in areas like legal and justice systems where there are unsolved problems, as well as reaching communities who wouldn't have an alternative. So I see responsible AI less as an academic or theoretical framework, but more as a, can we create net positive impact? And how do we build trust in these systems? So, and it's a very loaded term, and we'll unpack that over the next 30 or so minutes. But really, how do we help just not only build amazing solutions that help solve problems, but also take humans along the way in doing so? Gaia.
Gaia Bellone over here, Chief Data Scientist at Prudential. I wear a few hats over there. I'm head of Global Data Governance Program. I'm the head of the Global Responsible AI Program, and also I'm Chief Data and AI Officer for our emerging market. I've been in the financial services for quite a while, first in banking, now in insurance. And for us, the responsible AI, it's extremely important. It's really a way to develop, deploy, and manage AI solution under ethical principles that ensure fairness, ensure that we are able to share and provide services to the consumers in a fair way so they can trust our solution to support their needs, and we can offer our services to be in a way that is not trying to exclude minority, but actually open our services to everybody that needs them.
That's perfect. Good morning, everyone. Anagha Vyas. I head the AI Center of Excellence for Cardinal Health. Cardinal Health is a well-kept secret. We're a Fortune 14 company. We distribute pharmaceutical drugs and medical products. Responsible AI is definitely all of those things for Cardinal as well. The interesting aspect, though, is like AI systems itself they're socio-technical systems, right? So there is an interplay of societal dynamics, of human behavior, in addition to technology, and that's what makes it so unique. So there are risks and benefits based on how these AI systems are built, how they are used, who is using them, what is the context in which they are being used. So for us, responsible AI basically helps us get to those benefits while also ensuring that there is safety and accountability as we're building them.
Wonderful. Srini Shankar, Chief Business Officer at Global Logic. We're a premier digital engineering and product engineering company with about 30,000 plus people globally. And I think when it comes to AI, we've done a fair bit of work. We're doing a fair bit of work in terms of training some of the leading LLMs, providing data curation, content curation, and actually LLM training services, some of the top LLMs in the world. Look, I think when it comes to responsible AI, and to your question, right, I think what we are seeing as a service provider to our clients who are starting to build these enterprise-grade solutions is that in the last year, we've seen a shift from what I call peripheral proof point solutions. Stuff like, okay, I want to search all of my travel guidelines to find out what's my per diem in Spain for a vice president. I mean, those are the kind of use cases that we saw in the industry. Great, but truly not value accretive from an EPS standpoint. We're starting to see our enterprise clients shift now to use cases that are core to that business. And when you're shifting to use cases that are core to your business, that are accretive to EPS, then you've got to really think about building a strong foundation around enterprise-grade Gen AI that's responsible, reliable, and reusable. And that's what we do for our clients. And each of these three have very deep meaning and connotation, which we can talk about.
Sounds great. What I would love to do is start with data bias that, Gaia, you brought up. And I think it applies differently across the industries. And so if you can talk a little bit about equitable access, you touched on it, but also then I would like to open it up with a focus on bias mitigation across the different work that you do. So if I can ask you to start off.
Sure, with pleasure. So let's start to understand what bias is. Bias is really when we make decisions in such a way that favor certain outcomes versus instead representing what is really your population in general. The first thing that we need to do for mitigating bias is truly being aware that bias can exist and where it can come from. Bias can come from the data that we collect in the beginning for training our models. Bias can come from the algorithm per se, or bias can also come from the deployment and the data that goes through the productionization of our algorithm when they actually touch our consumers in the end. So having a system that allows us to test and check for bias in every of the possible sources of bias, it becomes extremely important. Because definitely, we don't want bias. Like bias, it's really touching the society. Bias can really make life, especially when we think about credit or insurance or financials. If you start to marginalize a part of the population, don't offer them the same credit opportunity just based on something that is not their credit situation, but it could be, for example, their gender. And that doesn't come because we want it to. Often bias is completely unintentional. It's just because in the data, we have rare events that are not really properly reflected. So when we use our algorithm, they tend to identify signal, but first would pick up the signal of the event that happened more often. And maybe what happened more often is that males have a higher income, so they would have access to higher credit, even though women with the same level of income, but there is not enough evidence that they have the same level of credit, they wouldn't get access to it. This is completely unintentional. It's not that we were we included gender in our attribute that created the bias. It's just coming from how the data is representing the population and how the algorithm wasn't able to really pick up on the true signal and was kind of trapped in where there was a higher signal. So being extremely aware of the sources of bias that can come when you build, deploy, and manage your algorithm afterwards, it's extremely important to really mitigate it over time.
In healthcare as well, right? Bias is actually, it can impact patient care, it can impact patient outcomes, it impacts health equity at large. So it definitely is a core sort of principle that we try to mitigate on a daily basis. Now, there are two types of biases, like the unintentional. So there's implicit bias and then there's explicit bias. Where there is explicit bias, you can make systemic process changes to ensure that you're mitigating for that bias. But there is implicit bias, which you are not even aware that are happening, and hence you have to continuously sort of monitor them. There's also an aspect of there are individual biases that you need to mitigate, but there's also structural and systemic biases that come into play, right? So an example, again, something that's very close to my heart is like India, for example, is the diabetes capital of the world. Not something that we want India to be known for, but it is. But unfortunately, if you look at the clinical trials that happen for diabetes management, they are disproportionately focused on the Western population. So we have the same medications that have actually been trialed on this population that are being given to people in India. Now, there's a different food culture there. There is a different lifestyle. So there are other aspects, especially for a disease like diabetes, that need to be taken into consideration, and hence that medication management could be very different. So there are some of these systemic issues as well that we have to handle when it comes to bias.
Look, I think just building on what you said, Anaga, on the healthcare side, I'm just reminded of a project that we're doing with a healthcare client that's in distribution of and disaggregation of care, which is care going remote, that allows care providers and caregivers to get information about specific disease states, indications, dosage, and all of that stuff. And you're absolutely right in the sense that when you train the model on smaller data sets, you don't detect bias. The moment you actually expand that in production to larger data sets, bias tends to creep in. So there's a few ways to deal with that from an implementation standpoint, which is to make sure that you're able to curate the data for larger data sets. We actually, in working with many of our clients in training LLMs, have very specific guidelines on factual accuracy, factual comprehensiveness, sensitivity, bias, compromising intellectual property, compromising non-public information. So you just have to append the prompts with these kind of guidelines that are in the background and built into these foundational models to be able to address concepts like bias, and not just concepts like bias, but also other aspects of responsible AI, like not compromising the company's confidential information, or sending out PII data that might be embedded in recordings, customer service recordings, and so on and so forth.
I'll just add a very small but helpful framework that we use often, and that is risk categorizations. There are some scenarios where the risk of a biased system or an output is so grave that you got to shut that use case down and not wait for, let's find a middle ground. There's some use cases too high risk if there is huge bias propagating through communities, like impact in criminal justice system and health and so on. And then there are other scenarios where you can live with the risk and you can build mitigations around it and be clear about those challenges. I just don't think we do well enough at shutting down these high-risk use cases or misuse cases. And then we just do blanket statements, how bias, bad. These are really hard problems to solve. So I'm just saying, more practically speaking, a risk-based approach is perhaps one of the ones we find to be able to get out of the door, learn, and iterate faster and not create significant harm.
So a follow-up question for the four of you. Do you find that, I think 5 years ago, you had to make a case that the data could be biased, or, it wasn't as, do you find now that this is something that most people are recognizing and actively working to kind of mitigate, or are you still kind of saying, hey, where's your data set coming from? What are the foundational pieces you're building into this? Like, have we moved, has the conversation moved forward, and has it evolved?
I can just start by saying, so yes, but the conversation has become a lot more clearer about data, about the quality of the data, and bias is one of the components of the quality of data. We're definitely seeing a lot smarter questions around what's powering the intelligence, and is it high quality information? Do we really want to use these data sets, and how do we make it more meaningful? Like, for example, in industries where there's a lot of knowledge being generated, users don't want, or customers don't always want insights delivered from all of that data, because guess what? It has like a lot of useless garbage in there that they don't want to train on. And so we're definitely seeing a lot more questions around not just, can you take all this data and do something with it, but curated content sets, extraction of higher quality knowledge to create newer forms of information. And then one last point I'd mention that we're also hearing a lot more on quality is many of our partners and customers are starting to ask the question of, do I need to organize my data differently for AI to consume versus human readers to consume? And that has been a more recent shift.
So I think my answer would be yes and no. The reason is, so the practitioner, they definitely understand bias better and better. But now we are start to live in an era where there is a democratization of data access, democratization of AI access. Now with LLM, I can just write a sentence and it's going to write me a program that will solve a business problem. So we start to have people that would be able to build their own AI solution. And we know, as you were suggesting, AI provides solution at scale, but also cause problem at scale. And those people are not really trained in understanding what are the risks associated with those AI solutions. So on one side, yes, the practitioners are getting better and better. But given that now there are people that are not practitioners that are able to access in a much more easy fashion than before, data and algorithms start to become a problem, which kind of really make the data governance piece extremely important, and the responsible AI framework that you build to manage your decision-making extremely important. So you can actually guide everybody to make the right decision and ask the right question to themselves and their data. So it's a cultural shift that needs to happen. Everybody needs to know about the risk associated with AI. Not just, oh my God, it's a super cool solution, and I can apply at scale, and I can do it without the data scientist.
That is such a good point, and I'm curious because we keep talking about put it out there and let people come up with their own use cases, and I wonder how many people also require people to take a course on guidelines and what you shouldn't do. So that's a really interesting point. And, Anaga, I think in the healthcare industry, it becomes even, I shouldn't say it becomes even more complicated because it is complicated, but you also have to deal with balancing compliance and privacy, and at the same time being able to innovate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to just continue the conversation on bias, think about the additional data signals that we have started getting, and they introduce new biases into the conversation or the consideration, right? I'm not wearing an Apple Watch, you are, which means there is a lot of
I feel like I should take it off now.
There are digital health signals that are being captured that you might choose to share with your provider, and hence they can take probably decisions that might not happen for me. Is that a bias? So there are a lot of these new digital signals and conversations that are going to continue to happen. So I think that bias conversation is going to be a really active area, a field that we have to continue to sort of keep an eye on. But to come to sort of data protection, yes, I think there are nuances in healthcare data that are significantly different from what we would have probably in the other domains. So just today morning at the breakfast table, I was talking to another speaker who was expressing frustration. He's been a caregiver for a family member that has been in and out of the hospital systems for several years now, and he was expressing frustration as to just how difficult it is to share information about that patient with different providers. It's next to impossible, even though we have all of our healthcare information exchange, we have the standards that, protocols that have been standardized, it still continues to be a problem. So I think from a data protection perspective, there is this delicate balance in healthcare. The more information that can be shared, the more insights and probably better patient outcomes that can be enabled. But then there is the privacy, and patients are reluctant to share all of the information. So there is this, it's almost like this delicate dance that we have to do between the availability of data, data security, and data protection. So I think we have all of the high trust, the HIPAA compliances in place to make sure that we are, the data that we are getting in is being used for the intended use. It's protected in the right way. But I think there are still gaps in that data that are really crucial to fill. So a lot of work needs to happen for us to get the data right. And then once we have that right data, making sure that we have all of the processes in place so that we can solve for some of these compliance and privacy issues. I think the other constraint that we see, especially in healthcare, is that patients are willing to share certain parts of data, but then they're also saying that, okay, you can use my data for this purpose only if it is anonymized or de-identified and things like that. So I think there is that additional check that we need to do as we use this data to build AI algorithms to make sure that we are staying compliant and respectful of our patient needs when we build AI systems.
And I'm very curious, are there use cases that have been identified in your industry where you feel the risk is too high and you're going to shut it down?
Sorry,
Are there use cases in your industry in health that you've identified where you feel the risk is too high and it's just not worth pursuing the AI scenarios?
Several times, yes. Sometimes, and especially sometimes de-identified data does not get us to the outcome that we need to get to. And I think, yes, there are, we do take the responsible call of, we move it to the shelf and wait for the right data to be available before we can move forward with that.
I actually have an interesting example around that it's around the human resources. I used to work in a company that at a certain point, actually really human resources, what they wanted to do, it was something good. They really wanted to understand what was the probability of attrition of our employees and try to address it in a positive way. But the risk that that would create actually adverse reaction, it was way too high. So even if the intent was good, the risk of adverse reaction was extremely high, so that project got shut down. And that would be a typical an example where, yes, I want to do something good, but the risk of using that information in the wrong way is not really worth it.
So that's interesting because what that brings forth is trust, right? The trust that you build within your stakeholders, within the community and beyond. And especially in healthcare, I mean, there's some use cases of minorities having lost trust in how their health data is being used. But also, I think that touches all industries. And so, Kriti, I'm wondering how do you address that question of trust, and what are the different ways in which you go about and have seen, the best cases of how you go about doing that?
So you can talk about things that work and things that need a lot more work.
Yes.
So what's working in very knowledge-heavy industries like legal or tax, these scenarios where you really, the human cognitive knowledge work that sits in the brain of a lawyer and accountant, is for you to trust a machine or a system, it needs to be able to cite its sources. And our customers and users value the explainability or just citations so much more than even accuracy or completeness. They just really want to be able to dig in themselves so they can understand and unpack. So some of those design practices, just explaining where the source came from, for example, it's not that hard to do, but it does create a very strong element of trust. Second thing that we're learning increasingly, and I wish I knew this a lot sooner, is bringing the combination of skills of people who understand the domain together with the actual engineering aspects of it. And increasingly, we're seeing these two roles fuse into one. As an example, in the legal industry, we've been rolling out a number of our legal AI capabilities pretty fast. And if 2 years ago you asked me what kind of profile of talent I was looking for, recruiting for, I would say a software engineer, ideally have operated in a legal environment. That'd be nice. Today, we need a lawyer who can also write code. And then in a few months from now, a few years from now, I think it would look a lot more lawyery. Any lawyers here who can also write a bit of Python code, please come and talk to me afterwards. But I do think bringing in the area of expertise and the ability to build stuff, it creates that product design experience from the get-go, so you don't need to go through lots and lots of motions, and then the quality of the results is better. And so that expertise coming in and not just content and data is very powerful. One area where I do think there's a lot more work to do is benchmarking. When someone says this product is good, how good and who decides that? These standards, because these evaluations are hard to do and they are very difficult to standardize. So I do think we need more benchmarks and industry standards a lot sooner, so it's not so subjective, and we can create more trust broadly in AI.
And so, go ahead, Gaia, I think you had something.
No, I had a question. I was thinking, what do you think about certification? So that actually can be published. Like, okay, we already publish our principle, for example, responsible AI principle are over there published. We say how we are going to use the data, et cetera. But what about to create a certification that are standardized and that can be global, that people can actually try to be certified as a company and then publish the fact that they've been certified to actually gain trust across the public?
Yeah, I think that's very powerful. Pretty much every company has their AI principles on the website. How do you align that to how is it actually being embedded? But also, I go back to the benchmarks and standards. How useful is the product? How accurate is it? How do I understand it? When to use it? When not to use it? For sure. And in the absence of standardized regulatory frameworks, especially for global companies, we have a whole different set of regulatory landscape in EU versus in the US and different parts of the world and the UK. For various reasons. It is extremely complex to build an AI product for a global business at this time, given the regulatory uncertainty, when we have new governments and legislative changes coming in many parts of the world at the same time. So yes, but I would add beyond certifications and alignment to the principles, also benchmarking of how good is the solution, or when to use it and when not to use it, and standardization will be powerful.
So I think we talked about bias, we talked about trust. I think your question about how has bias evolved over the last 5 years. The fact of the matter is that we will never get it perfect. It's just the pursuit of perfection, constant pursuit of perfection. I mean, think about it, right? I mean, there's much publicized examples of some of the largest tech companies who have investment capital that's deeper than the Mariana Trench, who've actually had public issues with trust around their LLMs. So it's going to be an evolution. But the one thing that we're seeing is that when it comes to guidelines for factual accuracy, when it comes to guidelines for bias or prevention of bias, when it comes to guidelines of factual comprehensiveness, the guidelines in working with some of the tech companies are getting better and better and better. We now have, as part of our content moderation capability, PhDs in English literature, who can actually superrate two outputs to understand between two outputs what is more factually comprehensive, what represents less bias. So it's a combination of just evolving guidelines and a new genre of people, that need to come together to be able to drive to that pursuit of perfection.
And even with all of that, I would say, there still will be critical decisions where you have to have the human in the loop. So an example is transcription seems to be a problem that has been solved, right? It's become better and better at understanding accents, really accurately representing what we are saying. But think about an AI scribe that is at a provider office that's sort of recording the conversation that is happening, and the doctor says, oh, this patient has contusion, and it's recorded as this patient has confusion. Can you think about how different the treatment would be for contusion versus confusion? Now, there's nothing wrong. I mean, it just is the nuance that is there. So reality is always going to be slightly noisy and imperfect. How do we make sure that we are still able to use the AI systems, but use them, with some level of human intervention? So,
yeah, it's look. I think there was one conference that I attended where there was a hypothetical example of, we are going towards driverless cars and level 3 and level 4 autonomy and stuff like that. There is no way a machine at the point of reckoning can make a decision if the choice is hitting a mother with a baby in a pram or hitting an old man. That's the only two choices.
Well,
There's no way in which a machine can make that decision, so you're never going to get to that level of perfection.
I don't think a human should make that decision. It's the
But
trolley
exactly,
problem.
it's like you are getting to situations like that where, it's never going to be perfect. There's always going to be some level of bias.
So it's interesting, there's two questions that come up, two different lines. One is, and you're touching on this, which is, so there's responsibility, there's guidelines, and then there's accountability. And then, so we can't talk about responsibility without talking about accountability, and we can't talk about accountability without talking about who's monitoring. You touched on regulatory framework. We know that we have multiple ones. A really easy example of this is like, I don't know, many, many years ago when you started having internet providers, services talking to each other, and yet terms of service that were different from country to country. And it was like, how do you connect those things? So this is so much more complicated than that. So how do you, and Srini, I want to know exactly, how do you go about operationalizing this complexity? And also, what is there is momentum, and then there's rushing it. So how do you balance those things?
So momentum versus rushing into it, if that's the question, the answer that it depends on really the use case. I'll give you two examples. I mean, you've got the use case of us building for a medical device company that's into class 2, class 3 devices, a product information bot. That had better have a very high level of accuracy because you're talking about a highly regulated product. If it's, for example, a insulin pump, that's like a patch pump, two patients who ask the question, how long can I wear the patch pump, should get the same answer. So the guideline has to be very strong. So there, I would index a lot more around not rushing in. You take another example of, let's say, technical support or service, right? This guided repair. Look, there you can afford to put something out there and then start iterating because what's the worst that can happen? The technician that goes out there for a guided repair chooses to ignore your bot that provides him or her guided repair. So it really depends on the use case where you have to set these standards and balance around whether you rush in or where you step back and look to much higher levels of accuracy and more stringent guidelines. So that's just the way. It really depends on the use case. And when we were debating a lot of these guidelines for some of our clients, I think one of our team members talked about the fact that it's called how well can the executive team sleep at night index. Right? It is out there. I mean, depending on the use case, you got to think about how well can you sleep at night.
So that's actually a really good segue to an audience question asking, do you start with a standpoint of, we'll never use Gen AI for ... which goes back to the use case that you mentioned. Do any of you have that, we'll never use it for this?
I would say that we will never use the word never.
Fair.
So it would be more like, as of now, I don't feel comfortable in using generative AI for these specific use cases because I need to understand the risk associated with it. So it could be more an evolution, like for example, and actually it's in generative AI becoming really a way of adoption. You start with the human in the loop in every interaction. Then when you start to truly learn how generative AI algorithm is working in that specific use case, you can start to tease out what might be a lower risk versus a higher risk. And then you might have, okay, lower risk, I just do sampling for the human in the loop. And then higher risk, instead, it keeps going forever, that actually the person needs to check every single outcome. And then you can keep develop up to, okay, this part can completely be automated with just an audit every 3 months and automated monitoring instead of this other solution. Like, for example, if it's an underwriting, I want the human in the loop most of the time, especially if it's a complex underwriting. But if it's just a branding exercise that I try to be relevant on topics that can be on social media, that can be a completely automated messages generated by generative AI.
I would add it's a more meaningful question to ask in these agentic systems, or when a machine can take actions on your behalf. That's when you really need to start asking. I find it's a bit difficult to answer that specifically for Gen AI, but more broadly the category within agentic systems. You give a machine full control to act on your behalf. That's when this question becomes really important. And the short answer is yes, we start with a standpoint of there are certain use cases where agentic or full delegation does not make sense.
Yeah. I think in healthcare, that's probably an easier question to answer. We will never use Gen AI for a clinical decision that will impact a patient life without having a doctor in the loop or a clinician in the loop at this point.
But you still might use it just to create all the reports so that then the human in the loop will go to
and
you.
assisted experience and augmented experience is definitely very much on the table, and it helps with some of that decisioning, but the final decision as of today still stays in the hands of that expert.
It's going to get a very hotly debated topic in just a few more months when the autopilot or agentic systems, autonomous systems start to emerge a lot more.
Yeah, and never give your car, never let the car. I got that use case. But I have another kind of, we talk a lot about guidelines, about kind of, do you have committees? Do you have teams that set the guidelines at your organizations about kind of AI ethics, responsibility? Is it broader in terms of technology in general, or is it specific? If you guys could give the audience an idea of, who are on those committees and what types of decisions, like does every decision go up? Like how is that done within your organizations?
So in my organization, actually, I'm leading it. But it's actually a team effort where you need a lot of expertise. You need the data scientist, you need legal, you need compliance, you need model risk, you need privacy officers, you need procurement. Like another layer that we did not talk about yet today, but is actually one of the major risks, the harder risk to manage is the vendor side. Like everything I build, I have complete visibility. From a vendor side, whatever I buy, which kind of visibility I can have, because I'm still accountable for the solution that I'm buying. The risk doesn't transfer. The risk is still on me that I decide to buy the solution. So really the team that you need to build the guardrails, build the framework, build the processes is a complex team that actually need to leverage all the knowledge needed to properly manage AI responsibly across the enterprise. You will need the data people in there. It's really not just a risk. It's a risk-based approach, but with many different competencies that are needed to really evaluate all the different risks. I've been working on it for creating the program for about a year, and while the core team, it's about 15 people with the different expertise, but then the reviewers, it's even broader. So whenever we created the policy, we actually brought the policy in front of the business side to get their feedback, given that they are the owner of the final risk, because they are the ones that usually use mostly the solution. So it's really an enterprise level work. It's not just a small team work or a data science work. Much broader.
Yeah, for sure. It's a cross-functional team that is needed, but we also it has to be sponsored at the highest level. So there has to be a CXO level sponsor that is responsible for AI ethics, and that's the way that it gets the due that it needs attention and the support that AI ethics need.
So just curious, and I would love to hear about, but do you have a standing team, or is it kind of ad hoc?
We have a standing team.
We have a standing team as well.
Same for us. I would just add, our AI ethics team works very closely, if not the same, as the business ethics team.
Okay. And
As a service provider, when we build these solutions, we see multidisciplinary teams, including legal. Most people are warmed up to now having legal in conversations because they've also evolved their thinking. So therefore, we see multidisciplinary teams across the board, and including legal and regulatory, especially in highly regulated industries like healthcare, financial services, and insurance.
And actually, if I can add something, while we have a central team that represent all the different expertise across the enterprise, then when we look at use cases, actually every business usually have their risk experts. So the one that are involved, the use case level, it would be the risk expert for the business. So it's a little bit different when you create the framework and you oversight the framework, and also you create escalation point in case there is a moment where people do not agree on the decision. But the day-to-day management of the risk associated with the use case, it's really related to the business in broader sense, which is the business and their risk partners and their tech partners, because they are the ones that understand the best the solution that they're trying to build and the risk associated with it.
We have a really intriguing question, and I don't know if we have enough detail from the audience, which is about the example of transcribing healthcare, that it may actually benefit from bias. And I'm not really sure in what way, but I will go to how do you decide if bias is desired? Is there any case in which you can think of?
Is bias desired?
I do have an example, if you want.
Just in the transcription example, if you look at pharmacies, right, there is a certain demographic of people that are pharmacists, and they have certain accents. So yes, if my AI scribe is trained to understand those people better, I'll have better outcomes in terms of what is being transcribed. So that comes to mind. But maybe it would be great, whoever asked the question, we're good to have a chat about this.
One example in healthcare is obviously a lot has been debated about diversity in clinical trials.
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is that the population that represents the subjects in the clinical trial should be a microcosm of the larger population that will be benefiting from the drug. And therefore, in that situation, if there are certain ethnicities, like there are certain indications that are prevalent in certain ethnicities, and therefore, I don't necessarily characterize that as inducing bias, but you've got to make sure that your clinical trial population is a microcosm and is representative of the population that's going to actually benefit from that treatment.
Okay. It went from 3 minutes to 0 minutes, so I think we're done asking questions. Thank you, all of you, for this. There's so much vendor risk. That was such a good point. I didn't get to ask you about your science fiction favorite film and movie, so we have to talk about that. But thank you all for really thoughtful responses and for participating, and thank you all for great questions.
Thank you.